Hello and welcome to this week's episode of About Abortion. There are within the pro-life world at least two major camps. We could call them the secular camp and the sacred camp. Now, I don't want to stereotype these or portray them unfairly, but I think it's fair to say we have at least these two major camps. The one that we might call the secular camp are in fact broadly mostly Christian by conviction. They are privately and perhaps in other contexts quite publicly and unashamedly Christian, but their philosophy is that when it comes to pro-life activism, we keep God out of the picture. We don't mention God, we don't mention our faith, but we have to argue in a kind of neutral way. We use secular arguments, and that's the way that they proceed. The organizations will try to hide their Christianity or suggest that they are not Christians, and they're just purely secular human rights organizations, and that's how they proceed. On the other hand, you've got, well, perhaps it's better to distinguish even this camp into two further camps. You've got those who say they're pro-life, but have what I would call quite a defeatist approach to the whole thing, which is, look, until the nation becomes Christian again, until everyone's converted, we can't see any social change because, you know, the foundation for pro-life conviction is the Christian faith. And so there's nothing we can do really other than just preach the gospel. And sometimes these folks would have quite a narrow conception of what it means to just preach the gospel. And they effectively, although they might say they support pro-life work in principle, in reality, there's no hope there for the time being. And so all efforts are diverted towards straight evangelism. And it's thought that the nation will become quite naturally pro-life once it becomes Christian again. And I have some sympathy with that view, and I certainly agree with the primacy of evangelism. But that's one of these kind of subcamps. The other subcamp would be those who do engage the culture very directly on the issue of abortion and other moral issues, but they argue much more from authority, and they certainly don't want to keep God out of the picture. And I want to really begin a conversation now about where should we place ourselves. Is it with one? Is it with the other? Is it somewhere in the middle? Is it somewhere totally different? Because without doubt, wherever we land on this question, I think we have to agree it's such an important question. Something that everyone's agreed on, I think, is we are in a culture that's moving further and further away at the moment from the gospel. We are seeking to engage a culture that's post-Christian, and indeed we could say increasingly anti-Christian. How do we do that? How do we engage in moral debate with a culture which largely does not share the foundational convictions that we do about God and the law of God? How do we do that? So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to play for you a recording of a talk I gave at the CBRUK Teams Conference just a few weeks ago. CBRUK, the Centre for Bioethical Reform. We've got teams all over the United Kingdom, out on the streets, engaging members of the public, using big pictures showing the humanity of life in the womb and exposing the inhumanity of what we call abortion, the violence done to human beings in the womb. And our teams go out there and they use a sort of Socratic questioning method, helping people to review their assumptions and beliefs about abortion. And by God's grace, we see many minds changed, and we see lives saved. And I think it's fair to say that whilst we wouldn't fall neatly into any of these camps, historically, we've had more of a secular approach on the streets with our pictures, science, human rights arguments, and that kind of logical Socratic questioning method. We've sought the common ground, and our basic argument has been, look, if you believe in human rights and the unborn child is a human being, which science shows us beyond any doubt, then shouldn't the unborn child also get human rights? That's kind of been the essence of what we at least lead with, not to the exclusion of evangelism and looking at the foundations. But that's been our predominant approach over the years. At our recent conference, Teams Conference, just about 4 weeks ago, I sought to introduce to people a way in which I believe we now need to go much further and much deeper in our apologetics, essentially. So I'm going to play for you now this clip. It's about 25 minutes, which is the lion's share of my talk, which was called Pro-Life Apologetics in a post-truth world. I hope you enjoy this, hope you find it helpful. And please understand, as I mentioned at the end of this talk, I'm not seeing this as a kind of a closed book. This is very much the beginning of us grappling with how do we engage the culture at this particular moment in time. I want us to begin thinking these things through, and I would welcome feedback. I'd welcome engagement, be that get in touch personally or on the YouTube channel, whatever. I know many of the people listening in on this are members of our public education teams, and so I hope this will be helpful to you guys as you think about how we're getting on, engaging members of the public. I know others listening in are church leaders or other Christians trying to think through how we engage the culture. So I hope this is going to be a helpful beginning to that conversation, and you can expect a lot more on this channel in the weeks to come, looking at how we engage spiritually and morally and in terms of social reform in a culture that has gone beyond post-Christian. Okay, but finally, and this kind of segues into the other section I want to look at, the sort of how do we engage the post-truth world. I think one of the hardest things, and I think a number of us have found this maybe increasingly, is Jane in the room, or is she in photojournalism? Jane Lawrence? Jane, you're here. I think it might have been you. I think it... Are you Jane? You're Jane? Okay. She was like, my name back? Am I Jane? Jane? I think it was Jane who was talking to me about this, but it seems that over the last 5 years, maybe especially, we've seen a bit of a shift. So with some people, whereas it was enough to show the reality of the baby and make the case, it was scientific ignorance, I didn't realize it was that developed, and so on. For many people, that was enough for them to make the connection and make the jump to being at least somewhat pro-life. But I think something we've seen increasingly in the last 5 years, certainly we've seen it in Norwich, is people able to look at the pictures, able to contemplate full-term abortion, even infanticide, and say, do you know what, I'm comfortable with that. Because it's at the end of the day, it's just her choice. It's up to me. It's about my rights. It's about my truth. It's my morality. And this really brings us on, well, how do we engage a culture that's increasingly going that way? Not a truth-centered culture, a self-centered culture, where really even the notion of objective truth is being left behind. How do we engage a post-truth culture? Now, before we dive into that, I just want to say, by way of sort of caveat, I still really believe that with huge swathes of people, the pictures are very effective and the human rights argument is very effective for loads of people. And I think there are at least two reasons for that, why they still work with many. First is, although we live in a culture that's increasingly godless, it does still have this post-Christian residual, the law and other structures and notions which may not be fully understood or consistently held to, but things like equality and care for the weak and so on. This kind of post-Christian hangover is real, and it still has an impact at various levels. So although we could say it's fading, perhaps, it's not gone and can still be used. The other reason is, perhaps more universal, more timeless than this, every human being does have a conscience. God's given us a conscience. His law is written on our hearts. We're made in the image of God. And instincts such as the maternal instinct are very strong. In fact, so strong that in Scripture, they are taken as a given, even amongst those who are evil. Right? Jesus said, though you're evil, you know how to give your children good gifts. And in Isaiah, it says, can a mother forget the child at her breast? It's just a given. Of course, it's not universally adhered to. We know that. But it's one of the most basic inbuilt instincts in human nature to care for one's own children. And it's not flawless. The conscience is not enough to save people or really transform them, but it is enough for people to know deep down what's wrong a lot of the time. So for those two reasons, I think the pictures and the human rights argument continue to work. I'm not saying we should give up on those, but increasingly we're running into trouble because I think our assumptions about our own culture are becoming outdated. Okay, in particular, our assumption that people will take science and reality seriously. I think two examples of this, the whole trans debate, we're seeing people quite happy to ignore very obvious biological reality. So people are quite happy to detach themselves from reality and just go with their feelings, their desires, and make their own reality. And a step further than that, they will then often perceive truth claims contrary to what they want. Rather than perceiving that as information, they will perceive that as a personal attack. As a hate, exactly. So they will see that as violence, it's an assault on them. Rather than just giving some information, actually that becomes an attack which they will then try and repel. I think a great example of this was we were doing a display in Norwich a few months ago, and we had, in this instance actually, we had just two living pictures, and then we had the sign in the middle saying follow the science, and it had just some information on the moment of fertilization. That's all it had. There was no moral language, there were no imperatives, it was just some scientific facts. And this woman came along and she instantly burst into a rage and said, so what you're doing is you're calling me a murderer. All it was just fact. Now, as it turned out, she had several embryos through IVF in a freezer somewhere, and she was about to discard them. But she made the connection. The facts convicted her, the truth, but she perceived that presentation of the facts as a personal attack, and so she rejects them. And so she's come back and again, just trying to fight against what we're doing, but all she's really fighting against is the facts, because we haven't said anything. Okay, so we're in a culture that's not only ambivalent towards objective truth, but actually often hostile to science even and reality. They'll follow the science if it suits, but they won't follow the science if it doesn't. So that's one assumption I think maybe is becoming more and more outdated. And the other one is that people care about human rights. People care about humans, basically. Now, most people will say they care about human rights, but do they actually? Because if it were true that people took science seriously and human rights seriously, it really would be as simple as show them the pictures, make the human rights argument, and they're with you. The fact that it doesn't go as easy, that shows, I think, there's much more at play beneath the surface that we need to be thinking about. I don't know if you found this, but people seem very comfortable with shifting the goalposts, even within a conversation. So you show the pictures, make the case, answer their questions, and they sort of shift the goalposts to still defend their position, even though all the reasons they've just given for it have been defeated. Okay, something else is at play there that I want to try and explore. So, sorry, I've left something in a bag over here. Sorry, I think my bag's here. I just want to give you a quote from Scott Glusendorf's book, The Case for Life. If you haven't read it, recommend it. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of About Abortion. I hope you're appreciating these podcasts. And if you are, can I ask for your help in getting these vital messages to more people? We're delighted that we can get these to people free of charge. But that's not free for us to produce. It costs something like £300 to £400 a month to get these podcasts produced. And I wonder if you could help us, partner with us financially. Many of us will have an Amazon Prime subscription or some kind of streaming platform to the tune of £6, £7, £8 a month. I wonder if you consider, as it were, taking out a subscription with us. If you could donate, say, £8 a month, if we had about 40 people donating around £8 a month, just £8 a month, that would help us to continue to do these podcasts free of charge for anyone who wants to listen in. And this is the only podcast specifically about abortion in the UK. It's the greatest injustice, not only of our time, but in all history. Would you help us to bring these life-saving messages to more people? And don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. Do send this in particular to your church leaders and anyone else you think might be interested. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll let you get back to the episode now. Right, let me read you this. I think this helps us to think about how whereas we're almost talking about the center of gravity culturally, legislatively, I want to think a bit about what it is, as it were, ideologically. Okay, so this is what Scott says, quoting someone else called J. Gresham Machen. Okay, he says this: false ideas are the greatest obstacles to the reception of the gospel. So he's speaking specifically about evangelism here, but it applies more broadly. We may preach with all the fervour of a reformer and yet succeed only in winning a straggler here and there
if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation or of the world to be controlled by ideas which, by the resistless force of logic, prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion, although we could say now maybe harmful delusion in our culture. Under such circumstances, what God desires us to do is to destroy the obstacle at its root. What is today a matter of academic speculation begins tomorrow to move armies and pull down empires. In that second stage, it has gone too far to be combated. The time to stop it was when it was still a matter of impassionate debate. So as Christians, we should try to mould the thought of the world in such a way as to make the acceptance of Christianity something more than a logical absurdity. Now, he says, the context that he says it's true that the decisive thing is the regenerative power of God. He's not saying, it's our clever arguments that have the power to change things. What he is saying is that ideas, and I would go further and say ideologies, worldviews, whole kind of networks of thinking, dictate people's particular thoughts and beliefs and attitudes, don't they? So as long as we leave those worldviews untouched, they will continue to dictate what they think about abortion, for example. Okay? So, again, it's not to say we can't see gains without going there, but I think unless we hit the ideologies and indeed the idols of our culture, those things will continue to move people to just shift the goalposts and justify what it is they want to have, even when it doesn't make sense. Okay? So we need to try and get to the source. Let me just read to you from two scriptures, Romans chapter 1, and then 2 Timothy 3. So trying to think about what's at the source, what's at the heart of our culture, what's driving this abortion culture. Okay, Romans chapter 1 from verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is ever to be praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but approve of those who practice them. And then 2 Timothy 3, just a couple of verses. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power, have nothing to do with them. That was 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 5. So do you see here, there are two things in particular that flow out from a suppression of the truth of God and the worship of the living God, and the adoption of idols, worshipping created things in their stead. There are two things that flow out from that. One is insanity and the other is depravity. Foolish thinking and foolish acting. That's where it comes from. Now, some people take this to the conclusion, which I would call a blinkered or even a defeatist evangelical view, that there's no point doing social reform until the whole country becomes converted and is Christian already. Some people take that view. Some people say, well, there's no point really. We're not going to see any change. We have to make everyone Christian first and then they'll become pro-life. I think that expression, I think, is false for at least two reasons. One is, we know non-Christians can become pro-life. We know that because of the conscience, because of the way God's made them, because of the post-Christian hangover in our culture. We know that non-Christians can be persuaded of the human rights case. We also know that Christians need to be persuaded. It's not as though you become a Christian, you automatically become pro-life, is it? How many Christians need to see the pictures and hear the case made? Right? So I don't think the answer is to drop social reform, activism, apologetics, whatever, and simply preach the gospel and hope that abortion will be ended automatically at the end. But the second reason, and possibly even more important, is I reject the idea that one should avoid issues of morality in evangelism. I don't think it's true that we should tiptoe around the moral issues in order to just do evangelism. I don't think that's how Jesus did evangelism. Jesus often made a beeline for the moral issue, for the heart issue, the thorny issue, the one that everyone else might have been tempted to avoid. But he spoke to the rich man about his money. He spoke to the woman at the well about her sex life. He spoke to the men with the squabbling over the inheritance. He talked about greed. Jesus didn't avoid the moral issues. In fact, the moral issues rightly handled are the perfect gateway and opportunity for evangelism, for sharing the gospel. So I don't think the answer is to drop all of this talk about abortion and just preach the gospel in a narrow sense. I don't think that's the answer. However, if we're going to reach our culture most effectively, and if we're going to, as Scott put it in his quote, if we're going to reach more than just the stragglers, I think we do need to hit the root more than we're currently doing. Okay? I think it was Alistair Campbell, wasn't it, who said, we don't do God in politics. Do you remember that? Was it Alistair Campbell? He said, we don't do God. Well, I'm saying we need to do God. Okay? In our conversations, we need to be prepared to do God. We need to root out idols. We need to proclaim the gospel. We need to engage at a religious and ideological level. Not all the time. It takes wisdom. There's an order to this kind of thing. Even Jesus didn't give it all at once, right? There's wisdom in where we start and how quickly we proceed. But we need to be prepared to engage at a religious and ideological level, okay? Because what precipitated 1967, as we've said, is not a dip in science. It wasn't just a dip in knowledge. That's not what caused 1967. But broadly looking at culture from a height, it was a culture moving away from God. It was the sexual revolution. And child sacrifice really is what the gods of our age have demanded, isn't it? The sexual revolution demanded as its price child sacrifice. That's where it's come from. It's the god of the self, and perhaps especially as expressed through sexual liberty, so-called. It's actually captivity, but thought of as liberty. That's really the source of this. That's where it's really come from. And I think we need to be prepared to go there. So this is why, I don't know if you've had conversations like this on the streets where you've shown the facts, you've presented the evidence, made the case, answered all their questions, and they can't disagree with anything you say, and then at the end they say, but I still think it's her choice. Have you had that conversation? But I do still think it's up to her. What's going on there? Even though you've presented the facts, you've made the case, they still kind of recoil, they rebound into the default position. And I think it's because what you're up against is not intellectual, it's spiritual. Okay? These are not intellectually honest or even intellectually free people making honest mistakes, but in fact these are ideologically committed people, one could say ideologically captive people, who will remain ideologically committed in the face of truth and sound arguments and evidence and so on, in the face of what is clearly humane and right. They will cling on. They'll rewrite reality itself in an instant. They'll move the goalposts at the drop of a hat to maintain the position. Why? Because it's not a position they got to because of intellectual persuasion or the scientific evidence. They are there. What does Romans 1 tell us? They've suppressed the truth of God, including in particular creation. They've denied his creation, that he is creator. They've worshipped idols, and the fruit of worshipping idols, two things, insanity and depravity. That's where this has come from. That's the source of it. They're killing babies because their idols tell them to. Idolatry dictates our thoughts and beliefs and behaviours. It's our sinful desires that sort of fasten us to our idols. Even it's our sinful behaviours that, or desires that generate our idols. We make idols in order to justify what we want to do. And this is why the evidence or the logic alone is not enough. Because what's controlling them? Jesus talked about how you have to bind the strong man up before you can take his stuff, right? As long as the strong man is not bound up. And I think we're seeing here something like that. Until we bind the strong man will continue to dictate what happens next. Think of it this way. If someone's a middleman in a kind of mafia gang, and the big boss has told them to go and do something, and you bump into them along the way, and you hear what they're going to do, and you prove logically it's not a good idea, and you say it wouldn't be kind, and you even say, and it wouldn't be good for you either, are they going to listen if they've got Don Corleone back at HQ waiting to see that the job's done, and if it's not done, they're sleeping with the fishes that night? For as long as they are living in the fear of the big boss, they're just not listening. And it doesn't really matter what you present to them, they're not going to hear. And so until their allegiance with that idol is broken, or until the idol itself is shattered, as long as they're in the grip of that idol, it will continue to dictate their thoughts and their decisions. And that's why I think we get that rebound. Well, I still just think it's her choice. Even though you've disproven every single point they've just made. But I still think it's just her choice. Okay, because the idol is dictating. So what I want to say is that when we find that the normal approach doesn't work, I think what we've uncovered there is a spiritual problem. I would even say in the church. When it's just not making sense in the church. Has anyone experienced that? This should be obvious. It's pretty clear in Scripture. We know when life begins. Why isn't this coming? What's blocking this? It's idolatry in the church. It's a spiritual issue. That's what we're up against. When things aren't making sense, normally there's idolatry at play. That's when people aren't making sense, often it's because of idolatry. Because what does idolatry breed? Insanity and depravity. One of the greatest lies of our age is the claim of secular humanism to be neutral. Have you come across this? It's as if we're the religious ones. We're the ones bringing our morality, and by the way, it's outdated. We're the ones campaigning we're the ones that are ideological. I saw that recently. There was some technology, I forget the details of the debate, but it's something to do with sanctity of life and so on. And there was a doctor, classic trope, the doctor saying, there'll be those who want to stop this for ideological reasons, but it's important that we progress with our science. Well, progressing with science is an ideology, especially if it's killing people to do it, right? So it's this great lie that we're the ideological ones, we're the ones that are morally charged, and secular society at large is neutral. It doesn't have a morality, it doesn't have a religion, it's gone beyond religion. It's a total lie, and it needs to be exposed. There is no neutral when it comes to the killing of babies. There's no neutral. The view that it's wrong to kill a baby is no more religious than the view that it's okay to kill a baby. They're both moral statements. They're both, in fact, religious statements. They're ideological statements. We need to stop allowing secular humanism to get away with being seen as neutral, as if it's not an ideology. Biblically, we know that we're all worshippers. We're created to worship. If we don't worship the living God, we'll worship something else. We're worshippers. We are religious. Secular humanists are religious. And I think it's one of the great lies of our age. We need to burst that bubble, really. Because as long as people think that, it's like a fish in water, right? A fish cannot describe water because it's just in the water. And I think it's like that with secular humanism. People don't realize they're actually caught up in a religion, really. It's the religion of our day, the worship of self, secular, individualism. This is every bit as much a religion as anything else. I remember going to America once, and all these Americans said of me, "Oh, he's got an accent." And I'm thinking, I think you'll find you're the ones with the accent, actually. But it's like that with secular humanism. They're like, they've got a religion, isn't it? What they don't realize is they have a religion. Secular humanism is a religion. It's, in part, it's a cult of death. It's a religion that demands child sacrifice. So we're all worshippers, including secular humanists. We all operate with an ultimate love, an ultimate authority which dictates everything else. I think we need to be prepared to expose that, to show what it is, expose what it's doing, the effects on people, on babies, on society, show what it promises. You know the thing about idols? They never deliver what they promised. They never deliver what they promise. And they can't carry out what they threaten. So if you don't obey them, they threaten you. Your life's going to be ruined. But they can't deliver what they promise. They can't carry out what they threaten. They are not gods at all. They're gods that are no gods at all. So I think we need to expose these foundations, root and branch. We need to show what this idol is. This idol demands the blood of innocent babies. This idol flies in the face of reality. This idol pretends to reject truth, and yet it becomes its own totally arbitrary truth. So I think we need to be prepared to expose the futility of this idol, the wickedness of this idol, expose it for what it is. I think we need to expose that what our culture really cares about is not following the science that it might claim to, and it's not actually equality and human rights, although it might claim to. What's actually going on here is the idolatry of self. What we really care about is our passions. That's what Scripture says. Lovers of self, lovers of pleasure. That's what's really going on here. And I'm not saying we bring that in a condemnatory way, but we help people to see what it is they're being swept up in and how it's not going to deliver what they think it will. Idolatry always disappoints. So I wanted to leave some time just for Q&A and just open discussion, really. I want to be clear that what I'm talking about here, what I've been talking about, is not really trying to announce any sort of new protocol as such or training. There's going to be more training further down the line. So we're going to be in touch with you guys about more training about some of the stuff I've been speaking about here. But really what I wanted to do in this session was just get the conversation going, really, get the ball rolling, plant some seeds, get people thinking about maybe some of the deeper foundational stuff, the spiritual stuff, the ideological stuff that maybe we haven't touched on as much in the past. Love to get your feedback, love to have a live conversation about it. So yeah, this is not about changing what you do next week as such, but just getting that conversation going. And in due course, we'll be bringing some new guidelines and training and so on. But I'm going to stop there so there's time for conversation. Yeah.